Right now, inside the FBI's crime lab in Quantico, Virginia, a single piece of evidence is sitting in a queue that could either end this case or leave it exactly where it's been for the last 3 months. Here's what makes that fact worth stopping on. A retired federal investigator who spent decades working cases like this one recently looked at everything made public about the Nancy Guthrie investigation and said something that stood out from the usual cautious statements law enforcement tends to give. He didn't call it a long shot. He called it the piece of evidence the entire case may now be riding on. So welcome if you're new here, and welcome back if you've been following this one with us. This is the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old mother of Today show co-anchor Savannah Guthrie, taken from her Tucson, Arizona home in the overnight hours of February 1st. And if you care about the kind of investigation that actually gets walked through step by step, evidence first, no guessing dressed up as certainty, you're in the right place. Go ahead and subscribe now, because a case like this can move fast the moment new evidence lands, and you don't want to be catching up after the fact. Let's start with where things actually stand, because more than 100 days in, this case has quietly become less about tips and more about laboratories. Investigators have DNA evidence spread across 5 separate labs right now. Think about that for a second. 5. Not one lab working one sample, but a whole network of forensic teams, each handling a different piece of what was recovered from that house and the surrounding area. Not all of it has led anywhere. Early in the investigation, a pair of gloves turned up about 2 miles from Guthrie's home, gloves that appeared similar to what the masked figure was seen wearing on her doorbell camera. Investigators pulled DNA from them, ran it, and got a name back. It just wasn't the name anyone was hoping for. The DNA traced to a restaurant worker in the area with no connection to the case at all. A real lead, fully worked, and a dead end. Here's the question that raises: if the most promising physical lead outside the house turned out to be nothing, how much weight does that put on whatever's left inside it? That's where this hair sample comes back in. According to law enforcement sources who've spoken with CBS News, the DNA recovered from inside Guthrie's home was first sent to a private lab in Florida, before eventually making its way to the FBI's laboratory at Quantico, where it's now undergoing more advanced testing. Sheriff Chris Nanos, who's led the local side of this investigation from day one, has been notably careful about confirming exactly what that evidence is. Asked directly whether it came from hair, bodily fluid, or something else entirely, he told reporters it would be inappropriate for him to say, citing the need to protect the integrity of the case and, if it ever comes to it, the right of whoever's eventually charged to a fair trial. That kind of restraint tells you something on its own. This isn't a sheriff talking around weak evidence to save face. This is a sheriff who knows exactly what he's holding and isn't willing to risk it. Now think about why the source of that DNA matters so much. If it turns out to be bodily fluid, that's actually the more straightforward path, since fluid typically yields a complete, usable genetic profile without much trouble. If it's a hair, everything depends on one detail: whether it still has its root attached. A hair with the root intact can often produce a full profile the same way blood or saliva can. A hair that fell out naturally, with no root, used to be close to useless for identifying a specific person. That's changed recently, and we'll get into exactly how, but for now, just hold on to that distinction, because it's the difference between an answer in weeks and an answer that may never come at all. Arizona State University forensic science professor April Stonehouse, who's been brought in to help explain the science behind this case publicly, put it plainly when asked whether DNA evidence would ultimately be what solves this. She said it can take more time, or it can take more DNA, and that investigators are essentially at the mercy of whatever the person responsible happened to leave behind. That's not a hedge. That's the honest shape of where this case actually sits right now. If you were running this investigation, and you had 5 labs working 5 different angles, Where would you be putting your own attention? The glove that already came back empty, or the piece of evidence a sheriff won't even describe out loud? Because there's a reason he's being that careful, and it has to do with what's sitting inside that Quantico lab, and what it would take for that sample to finally give this case the one thing it's been missing since the morning Nancy Guthrie's family found her front porch covered in blood. To understand why a sheriff would rather stay silent than say too much, you have to understand what's actually possible with a single strand of hair these days. Because the honest answer is more than almost anyone would have guessed 5 years ago. Here's the divide that matters. Every hair on your head is, at the cellular level, mostly dead tissue by the time it's visible. The shaft, the part that snags on fabric or gets left behind on a carpet, is made of cells that have already hardened. The same process that turns skin cells into fingernails. Once that happens, the cell loses its nucleus, and the nucleus is where almost all the DNA that can identify one specific person out of billions actually lives. That's the whole problem in one sentence. The part of a hair most likely to end up as evidence is, biologically, stripped of exactly the material a lab needs. The root is different. If a hair comes out forcibly, pulled rather than shed naturally, the follicle at the base still carries intact, nucleated cells. Pull a hair with the root attached, and a lab can often generate a full, courtroom-grade profile from it, no different from blood or saliva. Lose the root, and for most of forensic history, the honest answer was that there wasn't much a lab could do beyond a much weaker test that only works through the maternal line and can rule someone out, but never definitively rule someone in. So the question becomes obvious. Does the Guthrie hair have a root or not? And right now, that's one of the few details nobody involved in this case has confirmed publicly. Genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, one of the most recognized names in this field, has been tracking this exact question closely. Speaking with News Nation, she said hair absolutely can make the case solvable, and explained that recent advances have opened up thousands of cases that used to have no real forensic path forward. Cases where rootless hair was once the only physical evidence available. But she was also careful to lay out the other side of it. If the hair turns out to belong to Nancy herself, or to a family member, or to anyone else who had an innocent reason to be inside that house, it tells investigators nothing. As she put it, you just never know what that one small piece of evidence is going to be, and there's no way to know in advance which way this particular sample breaks. Think about that for a second. An entire case, one that's already burned through 100 days, several dead-end leads, and a $1 million reward with no arrest to show for it, may come down to whether one strand of hair happens to have a root on the end of it. Now here's where things get more complicated, and it's worth walking through slowly because it explains why this has taken so long. Sheriff Nanos has confirmed that some of the DNA recovered from the scene is mixed, meaning it contains genetic material from more than one person layered together in the same sample. Untangling a mixture like that isn't like running one clean profile through a database. It's closer to trying to separate several conversations recorded on top of each other and figure out who said what. The more contributors involved, the harder and slower that process becomes. Nanos has said investigators believe the sample is still workable, but he's stopped short of saying when, or even whether, it'll get to the point where it can be used for the kind of deep genetic genealogy work that's cracked other cold cases in recent years. Here's what still doesn't sit right with a lot of people following this case. If the mixed sample is this complicated, why has the hair, whatever it actually is, been treated separately from the start? C.C. Moore has said publicly that she doesn't believe the hair is part of that tangled mixture because labs typically isolate and clean hair evidence early, before contamination becomes an issue. If she's right, that would make it the cleanest, most isolated piece of DNA recovered from this entire investigation, sitting apart from everything else that's slowed this case down for months. So picture the lab in Quantico right now. On one side, A mixed sample from multiple contributors, still being teased apart. No clear timeline for when it'll be usable. On the other, one isolated sample, source still unconfirmed publicly. Currently, the single fastest path this case has to an actual name. If you were the lead agent on this, which one would you be checking on first thing every morning? Because there's a piece of this puzzle we haven't even gotten to yet, and it has nothing to do with a lab at all. It has to do with what happened on that porch before any of this evidence existed, and a retired federal profiler who says the blood tells its own story, one that doesn't need a single test result to be believed. That blood is the other half of this story, and it's worth understanding on its own terms, because it doesn't need a DNA lab to say something. It already has. Retired FBI profiler Jim Clemente, who spent more than 20 years with the Bureau, has gone through the footage from that morning frame by frame, and his read on the blood spatter outside Nancy Guthrie's front door is detailed enough to change how you picture what actually happened. He's identified what he describes as a mix of low-velocity and medium-velocity droplets, the kind of pattern that can form when someone coughs up blood after taking a hit to the face. Based on where those droplets landed, tightly clustered near the door before thinning out toward the driveway, Clemente believes Nancy's face came within a foot of the ground at some point, either on her knees or lying down entirely. Sit with that. Whatever else this case turns out to be, that detail alone tells you she was still alive on that porch, and that there was a struggle before she ever left it. Here's where it gets contested, though, because not every expert who's looked at this agrees on what it means. Clemente believes the pattern points to a single offender. His reasoning is straightforward. If two people had been controlling her, one of them would likely have kept physical hold of her the entire time, and she wouldn't have ended up on the ground coughing at all. To him, the fact that she clearly hit the ground suggests whoever was there lost control of the situation for a moment, then picked her up and carried her the rest of the way, face turned upward, which is why the blood trail simply stops, rather than continuing toward wherever she was ultimately taken. Other investigators who've looked at the same broad set of public facts have landed somewhere else entirely. At least one retired agent has argued a two-person operation is actually more likely here, pointing out how difficult it would be for one person alone to move an 84-year-old woman out of a house and off the property without drawing attention. Neither red has been confirmed by the people actually running this investigation. And it's worth saying clearly, this is expert interpretation of evidence made public, not an official finding. Nothing here should be treated as settled. But notice why this argument matters, beyond just curiosity. If Clemente's right, and there was only one person involved, then whatever DNA sample eventually comes back clean, whether it's that hair or something else, has the potential to be the whole case. One name, one match, done. If it was two people working together, a single clean profile only accounts for one of them, and the investigation still needs a second piece of evidence before anything closes. That's not a small distinction. That's the difference between this case ending and this case just getting one step further along. Now put that next to something else that's nagged at people since February. The doorbell camera itself. Investigators say it went dark before the masked figure ever appeared on Guthrie's porch, and it was missing entirely by the time deputies arrived the next morning. If you're planning something like this, ask yourself what the very first thing is you'd want to eliminate. A camera that doesn't forget. And yet, despite the camera being gone, the FBI and Google were still able to recover footage from it anyway. Footage that likely wasn't part of the plan at all. Does that sound to you like the work of someone who thought this through carefully? Or someone who made a mistake in the first 10 minutes that he still doesn't know he made? If you've been sitting with questions like that one, this is exactly the kind of case where staying subscribed actually pays off, because the next real update, whether it's DNA results or something else entirely, could come with very little warning. Because here's what still doesn't add up, even with everything laid out so far. A masked man, gloves, a backpack, a camera he clearly wanted gone. Someone who came prepared enough to plan for a specific woman on a specific night. And yet, more than 100 days later, no ransom demand has surfaced publicly. No communication. Nothing that explains what he actually wanted once he had her. If this was about money, where's the ask? And if it wasn't, what was it about?